Have you ever witnessed strange lights in the sky or experienced missing time? If so, you're not alone. These high strangeness incidents happen to people every day, all over the world, and we want to get to the bottom of them. Since 1969, MUFON has been at the forefront of UFO investigations, and we're not stopping now. Join Alex and Ruben, a team of highly skilled MUFON field investigators with years of experience committed to getting to the truth. We'll investigate UFO events through guest interviews and witness accounts, analyzing data from various sources. Let's work together to unravel the mysteries of the unknown and get answers to the questions that have been unanswered for so long.
Thank you for joining us and welcome to another episode of MUFON Up Close. My name is Alex Tusia and I'm joined by my co-host Ruben Uriarte. Ruben, how are you doing today?
Good, Alex. How did you survive Halloween?
I did. It was nice and quiet. Carved myself a nice UFO jack-o'-lantern, so it was pretty good. Pretty good.
Oh, did you take a picture of it?
I'll have to show you. I'll have to pull that up.
All right. Well, I was very fortunate. Unfortunately, I didn't get too many kids. Only 2 kids in my neighborhood, and I had all this candy and everything. And it's hard to judge how things. But I know those kids probably went to some other neighborhood to get their big candy.
Well, good. More candy for you, right?
Oh, I got rid of it, by the way.
That was quick. That was real quick.
So we have a really fascinating guest today.
Yeah, really excited to speak with Richard today. Richard Martini is a best-selling author and an award-winning writer and director. His 12 books about the afterlife have been #1 in their genre on Kindle, and that would be The Flip Side, It's a Wonderful Afterlife, Part 1 and 2, Hacking the Afterlife, Architecture of the Afterlife, Backstage Pass to the Flip Side, 1, 2, and 3, Architecture of the Afterlife, Divine Counsels in the Afterlife, Close Encounters of the Flip Side kind. He's also written and directed 8 theatrical features, including Limit Up, Cansman, You Can't Hurry Love, and he's curated historical content for Salt with Angelina Jolie and Hilary Swank, and was the associate to Philip Noyce on Salt. His documentaries include Journey into Tibet with Robert Thurman talking to Bill Paxton, and Flipside on Amazon Prime, and Hacking the Afterlife also on Amazon Prime and other platforms. His documentary about the afterlife, Under Hypnosis, Flipside, was also a bestseller in Kindle, #1 for its genre. His 8 books on the topic have all hit #1 in their genre. He's also had 12 appearances on Coast to Coast with George Norrie and on the Beyond Belief with George Norrie. This first appearance was the second highest rated show on the network for that George Norrie show. His 3 books with medium Jennifer Schaefer, Backstage Pass to the Flip Side, have all been to #1 in their genre after his Coast to Coast appearances. He has been a speaker at the Contact in the Desert conference that happens every year. He also has a new book out, Close Encounters of the Flip Side Kinds, which includes interviews with scientists off stage, as well as beings who don't incarnate on Earth. As a most viewed author on Quora.com, his Hacking the Afterlife forum has been viewed 55 million times, and his Hacking the Afterlife forum has 50,000 followers. His podcast, Hacking the Afterlife, with medium Jennifer Schaefer, also has 1.3 million views. A true Renaissance man, a man who can do it all. Richard Martini.
Thank you so much, guys, and thanks for doing this podcast. This is very cool. I appreciate it. I'm a little red-faced because as I'm hearing somebody talk, I wrote that over the years and I kept not editing stuff out. And so, look, if you're familiar with me, that's great. If you're not, we're going to talk about some very unusual things today. So Ruben, Alex, thanks so much. I got to meet you a little bit beforehand. And here we are in like 3 corners of the planet, sort of. Ruben and I are in California and Alex is in Colorado. And we're going to, of course, I'm I'm new to the MUFON story, in essence, because when they asked me to come and speak at Contact in the Desert, it's because people under hypnosis, which I've been filming for 15 years, or guided meditation, or through mediumship. I work with mediums who work with law enforcement, so I kind of have a handle on how effective they can be. Sometimes people would be talking about lifetimes off planet. I can tell you that in my first documentary, Flipside, was about Michael Newton's work, a hypnotherapist who had, I think, 7,000 clients before he published in 1984. The Newton Institute has continued on. They have 80,000 reports. And I was interviewing the president of the Newton Institute. He said, well, Rich, 35% of our reports include memories of lifetimes off planet. And so I can say that in the first book, Scott DeCampbell, a hypnotherapist I work with often out here in Los Angeles, he's at lightbetweenlives.com. Scott and I had been filming myself doing sessions, and then I would bring people to him to see what they had to say. And one of the more unusual sessions he called me about, and he said, hey, I just did this session with a guy who, while he was under hypnosis, felt like he normally incarnated on another planet. And so I heard the interview, because he sent me the MP3 with the guy's permission. And then I said, well, I'd love to meet this guy, because I thought, like anybody, here's a guy talking about another planet, talking about what his existence was like on that planet. And he wasn't aware of it here, but under hypnosis, fully aware of it. And talking about other people from his planet being here, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought, I got to meet this guy. Let me see if there's some part of his makeup, was he a Star Trek fan? Did he science fiction guy? No, he was a gardener. I mean, a landscape architect who had no background in sci-fi at all. And his whole life, it wasn't something he was interested in. He had the usual rough Star Wars and stuff that we all have. But what I've discovered was here was a guy who had no conscious awareness of what he was saying under hypnosis. So that's just one individual. And, you can always put that aside and say, well, we don't know what that is. But since him, and that was like 2010, 8, 9, somewhere in there, I've had dozens and dozens of people. And so the most recent book I did, I'll hold it up just because it's easier for me to talk about it. This is called Divine Counsels in the Afterlife. And what it is I met somebody who works with a think tank, a government think tank, that has people from all over the world that do guided meditations. They get together and they meditate on a topic. None of them had met me or knew me. They're scientists, they're doctors. There's a Harvard neuroscientist in there. There's a Montreal neuroscientist, and different people from different backgrounds. And so my friend was telling me how she's part of this group. And she said, Rich, you should try to do like an experiment. Why don't you take a group of people that are used to doing guided meditations, because it's kind of what I've been doing lately. In other words, hypnotherapy, that's a 4 to 6 hour session where I'm not asking any questions. I'm just filming. The guided meditation, I discovered that, friends of mine were saying, what is it you're doing? And I would tell them, and then I would say, well, close your eyes and what do you see? And what I found is that people, almost like it was like literally beneath the surface of the water, they could suddenly start talking to guides and teachers and council members that they'd never met before over coffee. So I've been filming people doing that. So that's what the last 2 books, Architecture of the Afterlife and Divine Counsels. And basically, I would just do a very simple guided meditation over Zoom, like we're doing now. I would tell people to picture themselves in a boat on a river. I call it the Beatles meditation. And then ask them, what does the boat look like? And, and then allows them to start to see things and talk about them. And then I would say, what does the river look like? And they would talk about the waterway. And then I would say, well, let's invite someone to come and talk to us, whoever that is. And that might be a relative. It might be somebody who passed away. It might be a guide.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people would say, I'm seeing this individual and I've never seen them before in my life, but they seem familiar to me. And then I shift my focus to the guide and ask them direct questions. Can I ask you a direct question? Do you know me, Richard? Are you familiar with me? Which is funny because sometimes the person will say, he's saying yes. I don't know how because I don't know who you are. But he says he does. That just allows me to think of the kind of questions I'm going to ask. And generally, I take people to visit their teachers.
Mm-hmm.
I call them council members. It's just a term to use. But generally, everyone on the planet, everyone in existence, has a council. They're not all the same. Everybody has their own. And generally, they're from 3 to like 15 individuals. And I'm not seeing them, but the people I'm talking to are. And so we go down the council. Who is this? And each council member, now Michael Newton talked about this in his work because he talked about councils. He called them the wisdom makers. That was his term. But I realized, while you're talking to somebody, especially in guided meditation, I'm not a hypnotherapist. No one's paid me to help them find something. So I'm under no rubric that says I can't ask questions. So I ask questions and I'll say, can we go to the first council member on your left that you're seeing? Sometimes they're outside, sometimes inside. And then I'll say, can I address you? Can I talk to you? Can I ask you questions? And if they say yes, they almost always do. I say, what's your role on this person's council? And they respond with a word: guidance, history, wisdom. Sometimes and when somebody says wisdom, I'll say, what's the difference between wisdom and knowledge? Because the answers are very interesting. They're all they come quickly. It's not like a person is, they're freaked out. The person I'm talking to is freaked out because they're seeing someone they've never met before consciously who seems to know everything about them. Because I'll say, how's our friend doing? And they'll say, needs to stop worrying about his health. He's a hypochondriac, stuff like that. And now, of course, you could argue that that's them, whatever. But then I ask questions that the person I'm talking to could not know the answer to, including, as we go down the row, sometimes there are beings that we can only describe as not being from here. Sometimes they take the classic shape of aliens, like the praying mantis version.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've heard of that. Or green. Sometimes lizard skin, skin that looks to be lizard-like. But here's the thing, and I know that those stories are gathered from people who've been terrified and had an abduction and they're freaked. But what I'm doing is that this is a person that I'm addressing that I know is on their council. They represent some quality in this person's lifetime, and usually all of their lifetimes. So I can then address the fella that looks like a lizard, let's say, lizard-like. I remember I asked this one fella, have you ever incarnated on the planet Earth? And his answer was, I wouldn't stoop so low. So, he was saying that he normally incarnates in another dimension. And then I asked the person who's seeing him, I said, no, reach out and touch his hand. And they were like, do I have to? I guess this is freaking me out. I'm like, well, please, just it's clearly a construct, right? So reach out and touch his hand. What does that feel like? Oh, this is weird. It feels familiar, like I know him. And then I'll say, is that accurate? Does this person know you? The council member might say no, might say yes. And then I'll say, have they ever incarnated on your planet or in your dimension? And then it gets interesting because sometimes they say, he's saying yes. I have no consciousness of it, and then I'll say to the council member, could you take us there? show us what your place looks like. Let's talk about, the culture. Let's talk about civilization. What do people do there? What are they learning? What does it look like? What's the environment like? What's the ground look like? What do the buildings look like? I ask a million questions. I try to always ask the same ones. Probably the most interesting and unusual, and this will, I think, for your audience, was there's a podcaster in the UK named Simon Bowen, Bown. I've done a couple of interviews with him. I remember 119, I think was this, number 119. And we were talking about my next book. I think it was Divine Councils. And we were just, chit-chatting away about councils. And I said, well, Simon, do you want to go and visit a council while we're on the air? And he was like, yeah, sure. Why not? So doing the same thing, just live on the air, doing a guided meditation. We go to visit this council. And somewhere along the line, we see an individual who looks like they incarnate on other planets. And then my questions led to Simon revealing that he had been abducted as a child, and he had never revealed it on the air and never talked about it. And I, chatty Cathy that I am, said, well, do you want to go explore that? And he said, yeah. And so we went. So what I do then is I say, let's go back to you try to not have fear associated with it, but let's go back to a visual, like where you're somewhere, and try to freeze the frame like a hologram. So there's no emotion associated with a photograph. Mm-hmm. It's locked in cement. And then tell me what you're seeing. And then he starts to describe a classic gray alien, the big eyes, the gray skin. And I say, can I ask this individual questions? Like, who's the pilot of this ship that you're on? And this fella came forward. And I said, can I ask you questions? And the answer was, Simon said, he's saying yes. And I said, okay. So what's your story? What are you doing here? What's the value of what you're doing? And his response was, have you ever donated blood? And I said, yeah. He said, these individuals that we visit agreed to donate genetic material before they incarnated. So in other words, he was saying not that they were friends with Simon in a previous life, but Simon in his previous lifetime had agreed, or wherever, agreed that when he incarnated on Earth, he would donate genetic material. Why? Because they take it to other places around the universe or other dimensions where they no longer can procreate. And I then say, well, wait a second. What's the ethics involved in that? You're stealing. I mean, in some cases, children missing, that sort of thing. You from John Mack talked about that stuff. What's the ethics involved? And he said, it was agreed to prior to incarnation. So we're just fulfilling that. And I said, so why is it when people encounter beings like you, they feel cold and indifference? And he said, because we're created, we're artificial intelligence, robots. And that's our job. He said the eyes actually function more as a telepathy, that the eyes are like transmitters. And then it's very interesting because he said at one point, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be answering these questions or not. And I did that classic, detective trick where I said, oh, no, it's fine. I'm just having you confirm what I already know. But he said, in essence, all the grays, that they're all robots, that they come here and they collect the information, and that in many cases, it's etheric. So the person is still lying in bed, but their etheric body is up in a spacecraft, their consciousness. And so they're aware of things going on. It's freaky, whatever. Now, I don't know how you get DNA out of an etheric body. I have no idea. But he said they take that material back with them. I said, so why is it you're so cold and indifferent? He said, does a hammer have emotions? He said it wouldn't be a very effective tool if it did. And I said, so how many years Earth years do you exist or live? He said about 400. And then about 400 Earth years in, we go back to the factory, he said, where we get an upgrade. And at the time I was thinking, oh, this will be interesting. Let's go to the factory. Let's find out who's upgrading, you know. And in anticipation of my question, he said, I don't want to talk about who the beings that are involved with creating us, because it's beyond your comprehension. It's beyond your ability to understand. And people have they assign negative aspects to, and negative meaning, you know, like holy aspects, like gods. You know, they assume that these people who are creating these artificial intelligences are somehow higher, smarter, wiser. He's saying it's not really that, but I don't want to get into it because it's too complicated. I was like, what a weird conversation to have. So I just want to say that in all of the times that I've spoken to people over the past 15 years who've had abduction experiences, doing the same thing of asking them, you know, what part of the abduction can you remember? Can you remember the spacecraft? And then using that photographic method, but saying, you know, turn it into a photograph. There's no emotion associated. Let's zoom closer to the structure of the ship. Let's touch it. What does it feel like? Let's go inside. How many crew members are there? And they answer the questions. And then I say, well, can I speak to, and there's only usually 3. Never more than 3. You know, I was always thinking like, oh, maybe it's a Star Trek, you know, like there's 100 being. No, there's like 3. And sometimes there are multiple ships and there might be one in, you know, each ship. Yeah. But when I ask, can I speak to the pilot? Then somebody comes forward and they describe this individual. And of course, they're not always grays. They're from different dimensions. And I will then ask, do you know the person who I'm talking to? They always have said yes, that they're colleagues, that they've known each other before, that they're coming to collect information. And then when I ask, like, what information are you collecting? They'll say it's the data on humanity, the data on how humans think and behave, and how consciousness works in humans. And then I ask questions about, are you know, they'll claim that this individual that I'm talking to has no conscious awareness of this, is like a technician who has agreed to incarnate on the planet, and that somehow they're helping people adjust consciousness. To what end? Telepathy. That humans who are all from other places used to be able to communicate with animals, trees, plants, but have forgotten how because of the filters on the brain, which Dr. Grayson talks about in his work at UVA, the book After, page 125. He talks about filters on the brain that block information not conducive to survival, dimensional stuff. So when people take LSD or they take drugs, they're bypassing the filters. You have a near-death experience, you're bypassing these filters. Out-of-body experience. Or, in my case, doing a guided meditation, you're bypassing these filters that normally block this information. You see? So, in essence, I've heard this repeatedly, that, you know, the method or what they're doing, the people that are here that are like colleagues that are working with the people off planet, they're helping, while they're asleep, I guess, because they're not consciously aware of it. You know, a third of your life you're asleep. We assume that nothing's happening. So, but anyway, one of them did say, in fact, the guy in Flipside said that while I'm asleep, I'm doing work with my colleagues to alter, tinker with consciousness so that people can communicate telepathically, because that will be the way that intelligences from other dimensions will communicate with us, just like in dreams. You know, in dreams, no lips move. You see people in dreams all the time, and you have conversations, and stuff happens. Do you ever notice that there's none of this moves? None of that. And people do communicate quite, you know, it's all telepathic. You could argue, well, I'm making it up, so of course it's telepathic. But in essence, sometimes people learn new information from relatives that are no longer on the planet. They hear new things. And those new things are all projected telepathically. So I think what you guys are doing, what you're both doing, Alex, Rubin, you're opening up this door to allow people to understand that there not only are other dimensions that we're not aware of, there's other individuals we're not aware of. They may be colleagues that we've incarnated with before. So there's nothing to fear from them. This idea where we project a human experience onto other creatures, other humans. He must want something from me. Well, that's because that's what I do. That's the way I navigate the planet. We have to be afraid. I mean, Stephen Hawking's a great example. One of his last essays was about the fear of aliens, about what's going to happen, and aliens are going to come here. And the only reason they haven't come here before is either because there's nothing to do here, or they just didn't hear the message. So God forbid you give them the message and then they show up. That's all human construct thinking, stage concept thinking. The way we think of how, first act, second act, third act, good guys, bad guys. Off planet, off stage, people report. None of that exists. That's all earth polarity. Good, bad, yin, yang. That's our awareness of how things work. Off stage, they don't have that. They don't have that positive, negative. Or if there is it's so minute as to be infinitesimal. But generally, so Stephen Hawking passed away. I worked with Jennifer Schaefer, a medium, on my podcast, Hacking the Afterlife. And when somebody passes away, they show up on our podcast. We have a friend, my friend, Luana Anders, who passed away in 1996, who started showing up to my family, who started showing up to my friends, who would see her. And, at first I was in denial, like, how could she exist? And so much so that I finally decided I've got to figure this out. How could she? I mean, if she can find us, how do we find her? And that eventually led me down this path into the flip side. And Jennifer Schaefer reached out to me. This medium works for the FBI, and she works with law enforcement agencies nationwide. She's very good at what she does. But she reached out and she was like, let's talk. And I went over to her office and I filmed her for 3 hours, accessing information that I only knew, that she was clearly like a cell phone to the other side. And from that point forward, every week for the past 8 years, we meet up. And about 2 years ago, during the pandemic, 2020, that's 4 years ago, 2020, we started putting it on a podcast. And so we talk to people off stage. But Luana Anders, my friend who passed away, Jennifer became aware of it. Oh my gosh, your friend is here. She is bringing this person forward. So it's like she's the moderator of our group. So one day, Stephen Hawking was brought forward and out of his chair. Luana, this is the way Jennifer saw it. She sees things, saw him being wheeled in, and then he stood up out of his chair and took his glasses off and said, now, what do you guys want to know? And I was like, well, have you been to visit a black hole? Yes, of course I have. Is it a portal? Is it how matter goes from this universe to the next? He said, it's a portal, but not the way you would understand. Okay. I said, have you seen any aliens? Because that was his last, essay. He said, Richard, he said, Richard, all human beings are aliens because they choose to incarnate on the planet. And then we talked to him about what it was like for him to cross over, to be an atheist, an adamant atheist, and then to realize, there's stuff still going on. Carl Sagan, for example, it was a wonderful interview, and it's unusual because the woman who produced the two movies, Contact, Linda Obst, and also I always forget the title of the McConaughey film. What is it?
Limitless?
No, the outer space one.
Oh,
Robin. You know what I'm talking about.
yeah, another one.
Christopher Nolan film. So she produced both of those films, and I reached out to her and I said, we had a conversation with Carl Sagan, and she said that's impossible. He did not believe in the afterlife.
Interstellar,
right?
Yeah.
And Linda just passed away a couple weeks ago, but I said to her at the time, I said, Linda, he didn't believe in the afterlife, but he does now. So when we had our interview with Carl, I asked him, so what was it like for you? He said, for a long time, I didn't see or experiencing anything. It's like being in a different frequency. He said, but I was walking a lot. I would see vistas and I would see a new vista. And I was just walking and just touring these vistas. I didn't realize people were around me because I couldn't access them. And I said, so when did it happen that you were accessed or you saw something different? He said, a friend of mine stopped me and shook me. And he recognized her. And then she said, I'm here, but I'm also there. And she showed him how she was still alive on the planet, but her higher self, the portion of our conscious energy we all leave behind, was shaking him out of his awareness. And from that point forward, he started to see others, his parents, his family, his friends, etc., etc. So that was interesting. The most fun one was Harry Dean Stanton. Harry Dean Stanton was an actor, a friend of mine. He was the king of skepticism. He would argue with you for hours about life ending and death. And he did many times. But then when he passed away, I thought, oh, what a great opportunity. So Harry, what's it like on the flip side? And I had Jennifer Schaefer. She didn't know him. And it's in the film Hacking the Afterlife. You can actually see the moment when I say, so Harry, what's it like for you? He said, I need you to tell people to believe in the afterlife. And I said, Harry, come on. All your friends are atheists. All are skeptics. If I go to your memorial and say that, they're going to laugh at me, that no one's going to believe I talked to you. So he gave me 3 private messages to 3 of his closest friends about their health issues. So when I went to the memorial, I went up to each one and I said, it's going to sound crazy. Harry wanted me to tell you this. And they were all flabbergasted because it was no one knew about these health issues. One son came up and hugged me. He said, oh my gosh, you just told my father what we've been trying to tell him for the longest time about his health. So, but what Harry said at the end of that was so fascinating. It was, tell people to believe in the possibility of an afterlife, and then they won't waste another minute of their lives arguing about it like I did. I mean, Harry even gave us, really unusual stuff. I asked him, so what was it like when you crossed over? He said, well, I was in a room with 5 women, but I was met by a baby. I said, who was the baby? He said, it was a child that I was supposed to have, but didn't come to term for whatever reason. And that child greeted me, and I was met with overwhelming, unconditional love. I thought that was interesting. But 5 women and a baby. That's the way he told it. So when I went to the memorial, I met a woman, actually the wife of the director of Lucky, which was his last movie. And I said, do you know how Harry passed? She said, oh, I was there. I said, so describe it to me. She said, well, there were 5 women with him. Interesting. I said, did he say anything unusual? She said, yeah. He turned to me and said, hand me the baby. But there was no baby in the room. So what Harry had told us a week earlier, this woman was now repeating, without any awareness of that. So listen, why is this information not commonly known, and why am I telling it? And Ruben's looking at me like, what are you talking about? And it really has to do, because I've been researching it for so long. And actually, I went to the University of Virginia to visit and present the stuff that I had. The University of Virginia has a lab called Department of Perceptual Studies, DOPS. And for the past, 2 or 3 decades, Ian Stevenson created it, and he's the guy who, the wife of the founder of Xerox was a Buddhist, and she said to her husband, you know, is Buddhism accurate that life goes on? And so he said, well, let me put some money towards it. And so he founded this group, and Stevenson went around the world gathering thousands of historically accurate reincarnation cases. And then Dr. Bruce Grayson ran the institute for the past 20 years. And he's the guy near-death experiences. They named the scale after him. His book After is really, really highly recommended. But then also Dr. Tucker, Jim Tucker, he wrote a book called Before, which is about 1,500 historically accurate reincarnation cases. Basically, they're showing that consciousness is not confined to the brain. And Dr. Kelly's books, Consciousness Unbound and Irreducible Mind, both, you know, highly decorated scientists demonstrating, and hundreds of peer-reviewed studies showing consciousness is not confined to the brain. Now, I spoke at DOPS last week on a Zoom call, and because they wanted an update of like what I've been doing, because I spoke to them, you know, that many years ago, and Dr. Grayson pointed out that hypnosis, and your viewers know this, I'm sure, is not considered a valid tool of science because of bias, because somebody wants to see a past life regression, and, you know, maybe the person wants to have it or they're being paid for it.
Mm-hmm.
So that allowed me, but then I thought, well, wait a second, near-death experiences are a valid science tool. So I started filming people who had them, but revisiting them and learning new information about their experience. And their hallmarks were identical with what people were saying under hypnosis. And plus, as I said to them, yeah, it could be biased. The only problem is that the people who were experiencing these things, what they say is consistent across the globe. So it doesn't matter who asks the questions. The answers are identical. And as Dr. Grayson put it in his book After, you can get objective data, science, results that are, you know, consistent and reproducible. You can get objective data from subjective experiences, dreams, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, LSD, whatever, by asking the subjects identical questions. So if you take someone who said, you know, just like Don Mack did. John Mack did the same thing, which is the Harvard scientist who studied people who had, abduction experiences, UFOs, at Harvard. But what he would do is ask people the same questions. And then once you get the same questions answered, so for example, 70% of people who have a near-death experience something.
Mm-hmm.
30% don't. So those people go around saying, well, nothing happened. There is, like Al Pacino said it the other day, I had a near-death event with COVID, and there is no bright light. There's nothing. Nothing happens. That's it. Well, that just means he doesn't remember. He has access to it. His filters are good. But 70% do experience things. 1 to 3% experience something negative. You know, the religious stuff. But that's only 1 to 3%. I mean, I've filmed 200 different people, and I had 1%. 2 people actually had a negative experience. Now, none of the details ever match in those negative experiences. People start talking about hell, right? It's a great word, but none of the details match. You know, it's like you see a guy with horns. Of course, I don't know why horns are negative. They're just matted hair and cartilage. I mean, whatever.
Is that actually what they're seeing in these negative experiences? Is some kind of personification of the devil?
Yes. But it's their perspective, a reflexive experience. I'll give you an example. Michael Newton was doing a session with a Protestant minister who in his hypnosis session suddenly started shouting, oh my gosh, Satan is coming for me. And he saw Satan as this guy with these giant horns and the red eyes and the classic, the flame coming out. And he was screaming like, oh my God, he's coming for me. And Newton, who had done thousands of sessions, said, well, describe his clothing. Is he wearing, what's he got? And the guy was like, oh my God, he's covered in hair, but he's wearing tennis shoes. And Newton said, well, what's that about? And he said, oh, I see what this is. Oh, this is my guide. My guide has donned this mask to frighten me. And he's saying, you have been doing this your entire life, scaring people with these visions. I wanted you to get a dose of your own medicine. And then he admitted that he had used that for power, for control over people. When you dig into it in that way, I've filmed people who are accessing this stuff and this during hypnosis. Somebody's recalling a previous lifetime where this one woman, it was like she lived in the Egyptian era, and the first thing she was experiencing was like sulfur and writhing bodies and fright. Of course, here she is in LA now. It's like these are tourists. They get to go and take snapshots and come back. That whole rubric of like, you go to hell and you don't come out of there. Well, everybody that's experienced it is out of there. I'm just saying. But in this case, the hypnotherapist said one simple question, which is, so why are we here? And I've seen him do that before. And that question makes it dissolve because they realize they've created that construct like a playwright. But again, the details never match. It's not like, listen, if a place existed like Schenectady, you could talk to 20 people who've been there. I was there. I saw what it looked like. And the details should match. I mean, even twins, right? But they don't. None in the history of the planet. I'm just adding that. I mean, I haven't seen every account, but every account I've ever seen, always. But I'll give you an example. I like to say it. Look, fear is a sales tool. We do sell fear quite a bit, as we know. It's a fun thing to do because it makes money. We can sell it. So I was interviewing a hypnotherapist. I'm sorry, I was interviewing a medium who had never talked about this before. But I said, so what was your first experience with spirit or seeing things, that other people couldn't? She said it was a gargoyle. I mean, she described this creature that could only be called a gargoyle. I mean, he had the classic look and the hair and the red eyes and hooves, and he walked up the wall backwards. And so just terrified. And as I was asking her, I could see that she was having a visceral reaction. And I said, well, let's take a photograph. What's the most visual, and she's seeing him across the room, like perched. Takes a photograph. I said, now turn that photograph into a hologram, 3D. Let's walk through the hologram. Let's go over to him and let's see if we can ask him a question. Mr. Gargoyle, can I ask you a question? I'm hearing yes. So, and I went right into it. So what are you doing scaring little girls? What's your problem? And his answer was, it's not my fault she sees me. Most people don't. And I said, well, what's up with the red eye? And he said, everybody where I'm from in my dimension, which is much denser, looks like me. And I like to come here on vacation because I can travel around. But nobody sees me. She saw me. It's not my fault. And then we talked about red eyes. He said, well, some frogs on Earth have red eyes, and some animals have hair. And, where I come from, we can walk up walls backwards. So then I said, well, let's go visit his dimension. Can we do that? And then she said, okay, he's showing me his family. And she said, and they all look like him, but smaller. So we went through this whole thing. And so by the end of the conversation, I said, so now let me ask you, do you have any fear associated with this fella? She was like, no. So that is true about fear, which is once you access people talk about dark entities, right? What's dark? It's the lack of light.
Yeah. It's the unknown. So, it's that you don't know what's in the dark. It's more scary
so
sometimes.
If you can freeze the dark, turn up the light. I'm a film guy. You just dial it up a little bit. I'll tell you, I was doing an interview with Tony Stockwell, who's a medium in England. And I said, what was your first experience with spirit? He said, well, there was a child in my bedroom when I was a kid, and he hung by the curtains, and I used to see him. And I said, do you know who he is? He said, no, I have no idea. I said, would you like to meet him? He said, what? I said, now, this is what I do. He said, oh, it's not the way I work. I said, it's okay. That's how I work. So let's go to take a photograph of this person in your room. Oh, he was like, it's all dark. He's in the shadows. I said, well, then take a hold of his hands, pull him into the light. He did. This individual identified himself as Tony's brother in a previous lifetime in the Victorian era. And then they went into this detailed thing. They lived in a workhouse, which is back in those days, the Dickens era, Victorian. There was no safety net. People, in fact, this movie Blitz is about that as well. It's just come out, Steve McQueen's movie. They didn't have, for poor people, if you were poor, you were up to yourself. They didn't have any safety net. So they had these workhouses where children starved to death. And that's what he and his brother did. But I also asked detailed questions like, did you ever go outside the house? And he mentioned going to a pub, which he named, and how they would go downstairs where they did bare knuckle boxing, and they would get scraps, bring a beer to somebody. They'd get food that way. I looked that up. It turns out that pub that he was talking about existed in the Victorian era, but was destroyed in World War II.
Huh.
So he had the name accurate, but it's no longer called that. All the details that he said were accurate. It's no longer there. The name of the street where the workhouse was, accurate. All these details. So I've been doing this for 15 years. And so when somebody tells me, this happened to me. So my first time that I did a hypnotherapy session, I was the skeptic. I thought, I'm going to prove this to be fake because no one's going to lead me somewhere. And I was prepared to say, I don't see anything for 4 hours. But Jimmy Quast of Easton Hypnosis did my session, and he worked with the Newton Institute. And after about 20, 30 minutes of me going, I don't see anything, black as night, he said, well, just look down. And when he said that, I saw my feet in a creek, and they were covered in blood and cuts. And he said, what are you wearing? And I like a classic, Spielberg pull back. And I saw myself wearing buckskin. And I said, I'm a Lakota medicine man. Consciously, I thought, oh, come on. You saw Dances with Wolves. You're making this up. But I allowed myself to just say the answers to his questions. So I ended up telling him my name. I ended up telling him where I was. He said, let's go to your teepee. I've never touched a teepee. But in this vision, I could feel it. I could feel the leather, the raw leather, opening it up. And I saw a woman face down. And I said, oh, they've killed my wife and taken my son. The emotion of that sentence was so raw. I'm looking at the back of a person's head. And I thought to myself, if I'm making this up, why would I experience something so traumatic? The worst of the worst. Mm-hmm. Anyway, at the and I said, and he said to me, who did this? I said, oh, it was the frickin' Huron. And consciously I was going, Huron, they're in upstate New York, the Lakota, blah, blah, blah. 6 months later, I'm in Eau Claire, Wisconsin at a family funeral. I start talking to this cousin who says, I've become a Lakota historian. And I said, oh, well, that's wild. Tell me. I said, well, I had this weird experience. He said, don't tell me anything. What were you wearing? I said, I was wearing buckskin. How many feathers? 2. He said, were they up? I said, no, they were down. He said, well, that means you were a medicine man. I said, well, what about this name? I called myself Watanka. And I know that from Dances with Wolves, Tatanka means buffalo. He said, oh, well, because the Great Spirit is called Wakantanka. And that's a shortened version of that. I said, well, what about the Huron? What about, the frickin' Huron? He said, you're standing in the spot where they fought for 60 years. Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Stuff I didn't know, couldn't have known, wasn't aware of. He gave me some books to read, eyewitness accounts back in that era. And all I can say is I read the accounts and I felt like I was watching a movie. So, it's not for everybody. Everybody doesn't need to like go and do a hypnotherapy session. They don't need to go and see a medium. They don't need to go do guided meditation. They don't have to do any of that stuff. But They can if they want to, or if something's haunting them, or they're having an issue with something, especially if it's related to these filters on the brain. You know, we all have loved ones who've said, you know, I saw grandma yesterday, whatever. And we have a tendency to go, no, you didn't, you know, or deny. Just allow for the possibility. And then ask some questions. What does she want to say? Or what do you feel like she wants to say? If it's associated with fear, then you got to go back to the beginning. Because if somebody's, you know, like freaking out over like their experience, you got to say, wait a second, let's go back to when it began and freeze that frame. Don't go forward. Just stay in the moment and let's ask questions. And so that's what I've been doing for, 15 years. So when we come back from the break, what are we doing? 53 in? We'll talk about how this book came about, because in here is interviews with John Mack, with J. Allen Hynek, the guy who coined the phrase Close Encounters of the Third Kind, interviews with his son. And I did a guided meditation with his son, Paul, because J. Allen Hynek was my science mentor in grade school. Very story. I was my nun, Catholic grade school. She wanted me to do a science fair project. And she said, and I want you to meet your science mentor. And his name is J. Allen Hynek. He was teaching at Northwestern. And he came over to my house a number of times, smoking his pipe. And I did win the state fair. I won the grand prize of the state fair that year for my 7th grade science fair project. But I didn't really think about him until I saw Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and I saw him. He's in the film. He has a cameo. I went, oh my God, there's my professor. And then it turned out, while I was at Contact in the Desert, I met Paul, his son, who was a scientist. And so using these techniques, I thought, well, let's just see. So I did a guided meditation with Paul. I asked him who he wanted to invite in his boat on a river, and he invited his dad. And so then I asked his dad a million questions, including, what's your impression of me? Do you remember me? That kind of thing. And his answer was, of course I remember you. You were annoying. You ask a lot of annoying questions. And he used the word persnickety. Persnickety, So then, without Jennifer Schaefer, the medium I do the podcast with, knowing anything about it, and it's a lot, you can watch it. You can go Google J. Allen Hynek. And I said to Jennifer, I want to talk to somebody. His name is J. Allen. And then I had all that information. And he said the same word, persnickety, through her. It's almost like a way of saying, ding, come on. How often do people use that word? But, he talked about other planets, aliens, about his journey as a scientist. He talks about all that stuff. John Mack, the same thing. John Mack, the Harvard scientist, died in a weird, bizarre car accident in England. So I asked him about that through Jennifer. She didn't know who I'm talking to. I just said his name is John. Oh, is this guy a professor of some kind or a teacher? Yeah. Let's find out. So what have you learned on the flip side? What's your experience now? What is it we need to focus on? You can ask questions about climate change. You can go to the scientist who would spend his whole life doing climate change studies and say, well, what's going on? How do we fix the planet? I've asked. And the answer coming up after the break. No. The answer was plant 1 trillion trees, because that'll bring the oxygen level up, bring carbon dioxide down, the temperature will adjust accordingly. I could never have thought of that answer, but that's how I got it from somebody on the flip side. Oh, I've been talking nonstop, but go ahead.
No, you've been doing great. Yeah, this will be a good time for us to hop into the break, though. And then when we come back, I'm sure that Ruben's like me, and we got a million questions for you.
That's great. So that was my preamble.
That was great. Thank you,
perfect.
Richard.
All right, very good. And how many minutes?
Hey members, the new KGRA DB app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRA DB programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRA DB.
The experiencer phenomenon is happening for a lot of people just like you all over the world. People are telling very similar stories about personal encounters with non-human intelligence. The Mutual UFO Network has research, resources, and support to help you make sense of what is happening. Our experiencer community is growing every day. Join MUFON, find your friends.
You're listening to the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Network. We provide unparalleled coverage of trending news in the world of ufology, cryptozoology, and paranormal phenomenon. Whether you're watching our video live stream or listening to one of our audio programs, you are getting the best from world-renowned researchers and hosts, guiding you through topics the mainstream won't touch. Miss one of your favorite programs? No problem. Head over to the members area at kgradb.com for access to our massive library of award-winning content. Make contact, stay connected, only at kgradb.com.
I was playing during the break. I was playing along with your music. It's kind of cool. It's in D, by the way, in case anyone's curious.
It sounded great.
Yeah.
Oh, you could hear it. I'm sorry. Didn't know. Guys, hi.
I'll let Ruben start off with a couple of his questions, and then
Sure.
I'll hop in there as well.
Oh, okay, Alex. Thank you. Couple of questions, but what's the difference, Richard, out of body experience versus near death experience?
Well,
are they the same? And the reason why I want to share an experience that I had. But
okay.
like,
Well, I mean, just the answer technically would be, from the psychological profile section thing. One is, one is the near-death experience, which meaning, you think you're going to die, and it looks like you're going to die, and looks like you're gone, and sometimes you're told you got to come back. Not everyone sees a light. Some people do, some people don't. Some people, it's just like a door. You're stepping on the other side of the door, and then it's odd, but 15% of people who have a near-death experience see Jesus, whether they believe in him or not. And so it's like, and there's Jesus. Like, I don't believe in you. And Jesus is saying, you don't have to believe in me, but you got to go back. There's a third act. Get out of here. Go back. And people are disconcerted because it's like they felt this joy and love and now they're back on stage, in pain usually. Out of body experience. Of course, Robert Monroe invented the term, and it was a scientist it happened to him. But I try to. It's that idea. Sometimes you have a buzzing sensation, and then you go through a hypnagogic state, and then you're flying around. Depending, some people fly around the room. In Monroe's case, he would actually plant things or pinch people, and then call them the next day to find out what happened. So he was very adept at it because he spent a lot of time. I have a friend who claims that she can do out-of-body experiences at will. And she does it every day. Like around 5 o'clock, she'll just go take a nap and go flying. And, she has no context for it, though, which is fine. It's an experience. Context is what I'm about or trying to. So essentially, it seems to be that it's, again, about filters on the brain. So your your brain has these filters. Some children don't have them until the age of 8. They see people that aren't there, or they recall previous lifetimes. Dr. Grayson notes that UK hospice care workers, that 70% of their dementia patients spontaneously recover memories when they shouldn't. The brains had atrophied. But as Grayson notes in his talk, Is Consciousness Produced by the Brain? It's on YouTube. He notes that they shouldn't be able to remember anything, but they do, because it's as if the filters are crashing. So I've talked to a lot of people who've had an out-of-body experience, near-death event, hallucinatory experience, vivid dream. They see somebody who's passed away and standing in the room, that sort of thing. So tell us about yours. What happened with you?
Well, back then I was into rodeos, and I was chasing a steer.
Oh,
And this was the Mexican rodeo version called charreadas. I was a charro, and I was into that for a while.
cool.
And so I went chasing the steer, and our version of Mexican steer wrestling is, real quickly, we just grab it by the tail, wrap the tail around our ankle, open up our horse, and you cause the steer to tumble. And you get points by the least amount of distance it takes to knock down the steer. Well, anyway, I was chasing the steer, and then the steer cut right in front of my horse, causing my horse to stumble. Went flying off the horse. Then when I hit the ground, all of a sudden I'm out of my body. I could see the horseshoes of my horse from above as he's rolling, and then I could see the arena. I could see the people, and I could see, everything from an aerial view. Then, bap! I was right back into my body, and when I was rolling, and then I hit the side of the wall. My head hit the side of the wall a little bit. What saved me was the big, large sombrero that I was wearing, because they cushioned me, protected.
Wow, yeah, sure. Wow, that's wild.
And so I got up, and I said, whoa, and then I grabbed my horse. But, I mean, just seeing the scenery and that, and I thought, did I get close to getting killed, or was it just that moment, that big thud,
dramatic event? Well, think about it. I mean, in terms of sequence of events, your head didn't get hit until after you were up above, so it's almost like you were anticipating what was about to happen. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who have near-death experiences that are similar, where they're like above their body looking down at the operating table. I'll tell you, Steph Arnold, an author who wrote a book about the 36 seconds where she was clinically dead, she had observed what you're talking about prior to giving birth. She saw the events. She saw that she was going to need a crash cart in the room where she was going to give birth, and she told that to the doctor. And the doctors were like, "Meh, come on, you saw that." But one of the nurses believed her, and so she brought a crash cart in, and it saved her life. But for the amount of time that she was outside her body, saw all those details. One of the most dramatic one is in a documentary called After Death, where they interviewed this woman who had a brain tumor, and she was in this very technical operation where they had to shut off her brain. So for 2 hours, no blood, no oxygen, and no electrical stimulus in the brain, for effectively dead for 2 hours. But she was consciously walking around the OR, listening to people having conversations, saying like, "What are you doing? What's going on?" It's also interesting that you note it that way, because in near-death experiences, David Bennett's book, Voyage of Purpose, comes to mind. Dr. Kenneth Ring's work, he tells the story of a guy who, in his near-death experience, saw himself at what they call a life review. for lack of a better term, but he's seeing all the negative things that he had done in his life, including road rage, where he jumped out of his car and pulled a guy out of his car, was beating him up. The way he witnessed it, his guides are all around him. He's above the scene. He can see above the scene the way you were looking down at the rodeo at one point. But he was also inside the body of the person being beaten up. So he was experiencing the trauma and the humiliation and the blood and all that stuff and the broken teeth. So it was like he had these 3 different perspectives, really. You know, he's talking about it now, and then he's seeing it from above. And he's also, so I think it has to do with what I like to term call conscious energy. You know, the word soul is a great word for music and a great word for food of the heart. But when it comes to talking about process, it kind of loses its luster. And people think of it as a noun or an object. What people report is that we have a percentage, we have conscious energy prior to incarnation, and we're aware of everything. We're aware of, not everything, we're not omniscient, but we're aware of all of our previous lifetimes. We have guides, we have teachers, we have council members, and we pitch them, you know, I'm going to have a lifetime where I'm going to do this radio stuff, but I'm also going to do a little bit of bull steer wrestling. And, you know, I can just see your guides going, really? How are you going to connect those dots? And you're like, I got it. I got it covered. It's fine. Watch me. And now you go and you get born and you're you're in Mexico, and then your parents drop you off at a gas station in Hayward. as we were joking.
Exactly.
But anyway,
true.
But that idea that we only bring a portion of our conscious energy to a lifetime. And so the average is between 20 and 40%. That's what people say. So you're talking to somebody under hypnosis. Who knows how they actually have a figure? But you say, how much did you bring? And they'll say, 32%. I've also had very interesting conversations with people with dementia, where the medium is talking to their higher self. I know the person who's in hospice care. He's not in the room, but I know who he is. And I'm saying to the medium, I want to talk to my friend Jack. And she's saying, well, your friend is like on the planet and off the planet. Okay, that's correct. Jack, how do you know me? And then he describes exactly what I was like when he first met me, and I was 16 years old. And then he talks about being only partially in his body. As he said, about 10% of his conscious energy was in his body, just enough to stay alive. I said, why is that? He said, well, 90% of me is back home already. It's like leaving a leg in the pool. But I'm doing that because I want my grandkids to come and say goodbye to me, which they did. And a week later, he was gone or, you know, out of the pool. So it's an unusual thing to even try to contemplate and discuss. I know that when I did my second hypnotherapy session, because it wasn't with Jimmy Quas, it was with Scott DeTamble. And I had written out some questions to ask him. And one of them was a question to my guide. Like, how do you become a guide? Like, what's the routine? As he asked the question, I'm going to ask your guide some questions now. And could your guide answer them through you? You know, that's the way Scott put it. And when he said that, I literally had the feeling of a portion of my conscious energy. I don't know why I'm using my head, but it's sort of portion lifted out and went over to the guide. And so now as I was talking, I was through the guide's point of view. And at some point, Scott asked me a question to the guide that entailed visiting my council. And in this construct, I'm seeing myself at visiting my council, but I'm not in me. I'm looking at me. I'm standing behind a podium, but my consciousness is in the guide, who's standing off and to the left, which I had reported 2 years earlier, but now I'm seeing it. And here's the weird part of it. When it happened, when I did this thing, and it's in the book Flipside, I told a joke to my council and they roared with laughter. That's the way I saw it and reported. But now from my guide's view, 2 years later, Scott's now accessing the moment I told that joke. and they chuckled. You see? I thought I was getting huge laughs. They were roaring with laughter. But from the guide's point of view, it was like, like that. And I instantly had the guide's awareness like, oh, Richard's not really supposed to see this. This is disconcerting for him because he realizes that his reality isn't exactly what's happening. And he said aloud to Scott, through me, Richard's been up here a lot of times, and he's a very funny guy, but we've kind of heard many of his jokes before. My point is only, we have this weird thing about consciousness. And so when you flew off the bowl, your adrenaline might have kicked in. That might have been the BAM that made everything, all your wiring fritz, like this is bad. And your consciousness is above. And it's funny, this is bad was a term that a friend of mine used in his near-death experience when we were in Tibet together. And I interviewed him about it. It's in the movie Hacking the Afterlife, where he revisits the event. And it's identical to what you're talking about. We were standing at the top of Mount Kailash, or near the top, 16,000 feet. And he had, whatever that is, you faint from not enough oxygen. Oh. And he now saw himself lying down on the ground. And he's looking around. You're up at the Himalaya level. And his first thought was, oh, this is bad. But then he said, a second later, I went, wait a second, that's not bad. Now I don't have any emotions. I don't have any connection to fear or any of the stuff that was bugging me. This is not so bad. Just an unusual aside. But you didn't have that, you see. You didn't get to the point of saying, oh, okay, I'm out of my body. Now I'm going to go visit, Paris. I'm going to go hang out or whatever. But that's what it appears to be, which is they're the same things, literally, near-death experience and out-of-body experience, because your filters on your brain have gone, disappeared, have lifted so that you can be aware of these things. And then eventually they come back. And that's what the BAM is. So that you're like, oh, I'm back. But you had no context for it. Like, it was just, wow. And so what was the injury like? Did you have a headache or?
I had just some scratches on my cheek.
Very lucky.
Fortunately, nothing broken. And
there's a movie called Cowboy Up. Nobody's seen it. Stars Kiefer Sutherland. I shot all the second unit in it, and it's bull riding.
Oh wow!
And the guys who the Kiefer plays a guy who they call him what do they call them? They call them clowns, but they're not clowns. They're the performers that go out there and distract people. And so I spent like 6 weeks, something like that, in the shoots with guys like you, crazy people.
I have a plate in my arm from riding a bull.
Hello. But by the way, Ruben, it's a metaphor for life, because you get on the life and you get 8 seconds. I don't know how many seconds you guys had, but in bull riding, it's 8 seconds. And if you can hang on to that bull, you're on to the next one. If you get stomped to death, then you go off stage, you come back, you go, I think I'm on a re-ride. And then, the metaphor for coming back.
You ride a bull. There's no timing. You have to.
Oh, you gotta tackle it, or that's it. Wow.
You gotta dismount as soon as it stops bucking, and so you can go on for half a minute.
Wow.
A lot. Yeah.
Crazy.
It was. I'm glad I'm here.
Well, like I say, you know what? The life planning session, if you can access it, they're all going to be up there doing this. You pulled it off. We didn't believe you. How about you, Alex? Any questions? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so I got a question. Is there any reason why some people view their memories or their dreams in a third person versus viewing it through their own eyes? Is there any kind of distinction between the way that you're kind of viewing these memories or dreams?
Well, I think what we're talking about, it's that thing about consciousness. The guys that I spoke to at University of Virginia last week, that's what they study. Scientists, they're trying to figure out what consciousness is, and of course the tech guys in Silicon Valley considered an emergent, that out of a mass of synapses comes consciousness. Well, that's not in the data. It's the opposite, that we're fully conscious, fully aware, and we dumb down to be able to come to the planet. We lose our ability to remember all these other we can fly at the speed of thought off planet. We can go in other dimensions. We can hang out with other people. We can construct anything. I mean, I heard this from Carl Laemmle, the guy who founded Universal Pictures, who died in 1939. He said, basically, I create any cinematic universe that I want. I can fly at the speed of thought. I can taste different flavors. He said, when you get bored, that's when you decide to return, meaning reincarnate. So when you see somebody having a dream, like I said, dreams are telepathy. So when you're having a dream and you're in the dream, I'll give you this fun example. It's a little bit of a side thing, but I was in a dream. I was in Mexico City. Have you been there, Ruben?
Yes.
You know it. Beautiful. Like, it's a European city on the American continent. It's just an amazing city. I had won a film festival. And so I went down there to collect my big, fat 3,000 peso check. Back in those days, that was it was more than that. It was about $3,000 anyway. So I went down to the city. I got a chance to see it and smell it and taste it and be part of it. And now here it is, I don't know, 30 years later, I'm having a dream where I'm being chased around Mexico City by a gang. I was never chased by a gang. I may have seen, 60 Minutes thing on it. I don't know why, but I'm being chased and I'm going through that emotional trauma that you have of like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to escape. I'm not going to get out of here. We've all had those dreams, I hope. But a cab appeared and I jumped in the cab. And the guy took off. And I remember thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I'm saved. This guy has saved me. That's weird. And I looked at the cab driver and I said in Spanish, my best Spanish I could muster, thank you so much for saving me. And he looked in the mirror, I could see his eyes in the rearview mirror, and he said, no problem. And the way he said it, I went, wait a second, are you an actor? And he looked in the mirror like, oh my gosh, I'm busted. I was supposed to answer in Spanish, but I answered in English. He said, yeah, I am. I said, so do you go around playing a cab driver? He said, well, I show up in whatever role people need. So he's a guy who's sleeping somewhere else on the planet playing this role in my dream. And what since then I've discovered that when you get to the end of a dream, you're starting to wake up and you're like, what the heck was that about? I stop and say, I want to thank all the actors for appearing in my dream. And sometimes literally the characters who are playing look at me like, what is he saying? Why does he know we're actors? It's weird. It's a weird construct, but I have a feeling I'm onto something there, which is that dreams themselves may be like group exercises, even though they don't make any sense to us. We go from one place to the next. I've been having a lot of dreams like that recently, where I'm in another dimension on another planet and something's going on. It might be related to a film being made and there's people there and I interact with them trying to help, somebody do something. And then at the end of the dream, I wake up and I think, gosh, that was so weird. I have no connection to it, in terms of my life. I wasn't working out, the pepperoni pizza that I had the night before. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but
no, that was perfect. For any of these actors that you come across in your dreams, have you ever met one in real life? Like somebody that you've had a dream and you meet them for the first time and you say, this person seems real familiar. Maybe I've seen them before in a dream.
Oh yeah. Well, I would say in terms of dreams, I can't think of any I have had dreams of like a presaging dream, you know, like something's going to happen or something, some event. And I bring them to Jennifer Schaefer and our podcast. And we've got quite a few podcasts where it starts off with me saying, I just say, who does Luana want to bring? Our moderator on the flip side, Luana Anders, she was in over 300 movies and TV shows. And I was with her for 20 years. And so when she shows up, she'll bring somebody that she knows or worked with. And sometimes because they've come to her and asked her to help us pass a message to their family. I know that sounds weird, but that's how it works. And I'll say, sometimes I've had the experience. I've heard a voice in my head, in my house, and I'm thinking to myself, why am I hearing this famous person's voice? And I hear the words, I understand you're the guy who's going to help me pass a message to my family. And I say, I'm not the guy. You got to get Luana to put you on the guest list. That's why I called the book Backstage Pass to the Flip Side, because Tom Petty had shown up in a podcast or in a session. And I said, I didn't know Tom. I mean, I used to write music reviews for Variety, but I didn't know him. And I don't think Luana knew him. And Jennifer didn't know him. I said, why is he here? She's, without answering that question, she said, oh, he's saying you have no idea how hard it is to talk to you guys. There's a line around the block. And your friend Luana is like the bouncer at the velvet rope saying who gets in. So if you don't get on our guest list, you don't get to talk. So when people have shown up, I've said that, well, just, you know, get on Luana's guest list and we'll be happy to chat with you. And then I pass the messages along to their families, whether they want to hear them or not. And I have had people say, I've had people write me back and say, you know, I miss my father, brother, sister, mother, and I wish I could talk to them, and I don't think you are. And then I write them back. I said, that's fine. You know, I did my best. You know, and then when they show up again, I say, look, guys, yeah, you know, go talk to somebody. And, you know, I tried. And they'll say they'll eventually get the message. Mm-hmm. Like it's an early thing. But to go back to your question, which was the feeling of knowing people. And I found that this is a perfect way to get into this topic with humans, as opposed to aliens, but to get into topic with people, which I asked the question to especially couples that have been married a long time. When did you know he was the one? When did you know she was the one? And usually people have a story, you know, an origin story where they talk about, you know, I was going to the university and then I met him and then she introduced me and da-da-da-da-da and, you know, whatever. And sometimes people go, I still don't know he's the one. So I was talking to my sister-in-law who lives in Salt Lake City, and that was her answer. They have 5 kids. I said, no, come on. When did you know? When did you allow? And she said, well, it was a second date. And there was something in the look in his eye and something in the sound of his voice that made me feel like I was home. And then I said, what about your husband? And she said, don't ask him. He doesn't believe in that stuff. So I asked him, I said, what about you? He said, oh, it was the moment I saw her. We were in a class together. I looked over and I said, oh, there's my wife. Some people sense it and feel it immediately. And so it's a fun way to ask your parents, like, how, you know, if your parents are still on the planet, you can say, so when did you guys know? And sometimes they've never talked about it. Really, you know, it's like, when did you know? I've had one woman say, I knew because I was nauseous. And I said, what does that mean? She said, because I realized I was never going to sleep with any other man in my life. It made me nauseous. You know, people do. My wife, I was at Starbucks and I started, actually, I was like, I was sitting there, you know, reading the paper and a light came into my eye, like, you know, like a reflection. And I look over and it was a little necklace she had that had a reflector on it. And it was just right in my eye. I found out later on that some guy had stolen her necklace off her neck the night before, and then she had replaced it with this one. And I started talking to her, and I said, within a few minutes, I said, oh my gosh, it's like I've been waiting to talk to her. I said, why don't we just skip down, get married, and have a couple of kids? And she looked at me like, what? And then I went off to New York. I was working on the movie Salt and whatever. No, actually, it was a Charles Grodin show. I'm dating myself. Back in 1997. But anyway, she says that I say that to everybody at Starbucks. But all I can say is she had the experience of looking at me and going, oh, there he is. And I had the experience of going, oh, my gosh, there you are. Sandra Bullock, when she found the child that she adopted, she tells that story of she's going into the orphanage and she's going down the rows, and then she sees her son and says, oh, there you are. It's like our higher self is cutting through the filters for a moment to give you a feeling or a sensation. Like, they're not going to tell you the whole story. It would ruin the play. But they give you that indication, like, this is somebody, even if it doesn't last, but this is somebody who's going to be important in your life. Maybe you're going to have kids with them, you know, maybe the children are on the flip side going, come on, that guy, come on. There's the guy, you know, stop wasting your time. So does that make sense?
Yeah. You know, kind of going off of that, what are your thoughts on, you know, the idea that, you know, like lovers may have known in a past life, or, you know, I think there's a Japanese proverb that, you know, you, when you're reincarnated, you have the face of your previous lover. You know, what are your kind of thoughts on those kind of things?
Well, I know I love, you know, there's the Kabbalah that talks about the red string that goes through your life. And it's also, there's a Japanese thing of that. And then there's a Tibetan thing, you know, you go see the Dalai Lama and they put a red string around you. It's the red string represents the string of your life. So when you meet somebody that you feel like you've known them forever, just allow that it's possible you have. That's the bottom line with that. I know it for a fact because 15 years of talking to people off stage, whether it's through a medium who's taught, like I have a cell phone to people that I know that are off stage. I'm asking, you know, how'd you guys meet, or how'd that happen, or what was the plan, or what? And they describe this elaborate, sometimes over many lifetimes plan. You know, we are stuck in our time frame. We think 80 years is a long time. To people off stage, and I've heard this consistently, 25 Earth years feels like 5 or 10 minutes to them. So somebody who lives an entire lifetime, when they get back home, they've been gone for an hour and a half. It's not that big of a deal. You know, even though people here are like, oh my God, I'm stressing and I'm going through this nightmare. Once off stage, it's like, oh, right. It happened like in the blink of an eye. When you meet people that are in your classroom, let's say, and I call it a classroom because, you know, homeroom, when you were a kid, you know, you went into homeroom and they took attendance, and then you went off into your other classes. They were different, you know, gym class, whatever. You had friends, you have family, but you have a core group of people that you apparently incarnate with often and often and often again, even if you don't like them, but they're people who are there to play a role in your life. And so you run into them and it feels like you've known them forever. Now, listen, you don't have to know that, because that could ruin the play. It's literally like an actor constantly going, I remember this play. Yeah, that's right. To be or not to be. That comes after this line. You're like, dude, you're ruining the play. Just be in the moment. And there's a lot of people who prefer, and you could argue that, you know, people who cure diseases, if they really believe that they've had many lifetimes working on the same problem, it's not that big of a deal. Like, maybe I should spend some more time at home instead of in the office. But the filters on the brain prevent that, because they think there's only one life. This is the only life I'm going to have. And they'll argue, I'm only going to look like this person. I'm only going to have these attributes this one time. Well, you're going to have different attributes the next time, just like an actor on stage. You know, even if you've done Othello like 100 times, there's certain people in the cast that you recognize. Oh, didn't you play Iago Wait, you're Juliet. I know you. That sort of thing. So listen, what's fun about this research is the fact that you can ask questions. That's the part that really makes it amusing, because instead of this fear-based thing that we do of like, don't talk to people they can't be dead if they can give you new information. Let's just start there. And in terms of prophets, talking about biblical texts, those guys are mediums. They're talking to people off stage, clearly. But, people will quote the Bible and say, the Bible says don't talk to people that are off stage. All those guys are off stage. Anyway, and so that's what makes it kind of unusual and kind of fun. And I think it's a key to not be connected to the fear aspect of it. So when I'm talking to a person who's going down their counsel and they'll see, oh, this is a person who looks very strange because they don't incarnate on the planet. And there's a certain amount of trepidation of like asking them questions. Okay. But then you go to the next person and you're like, oh my gosh, that's my grandfather. And then I'll ask, are you presenting yourself as a grandfather? Is this person's grandfather, like their memory, so that they'll be comfortable? Or are you actually that person? And sometimes they'll say, I'm actually that person. They're projecting that image of their frequency, projecting that image, and the person is seeing them as such. And then they go down to the next person, and it's some kind of figure that we normally ascribe to religions. They're avatars, let's say. And the reason I put it that way is because if you ask them questions, they'll say, well, there's no religion on the planet that's accurate in terms of what's happening, which offends people. I can understand, but I'm an equal opportunity offender. I like to ask questions, and if the answer is different, I'm happy to report it. So I don't know if you're aware of that, but I was going to say 15% of near-death experiences, according to Dr. Grayson, people see Jesus, that fella, whether they believe in him or not. Skeptics, atheists, Hindus, doesn't matter. They see the guy known as Jesus, and they go, he sends them back, as we mentioned, right? Go back on stage. Well, he shows up a lot in this research. So I'm doing, filming people under hypnosis. I'm talking to mediums, or I'm doing guided meditations. He shows up quite often. So often that the former head of Paramount Studios, David Kirkpatrick, asked me to write a book about these interviews where people claim to be seeing him. What does he say? So the book is called, here, I have it right here. It's called The Greatest Story. I know you guys are not a religious podcast and I don't want to offend anybody, but here we are. The Greatest Story Never Told is told by Jesus and those who knew him. So these are people who are seeing him or other avatars and asking my questions. Can I ask you a question? I'll give you one. This medium was seeing him in the room, and as I said, can he come closer to you? And as I said that, she started to cry, and her face turned like beet red, and she couldn't breathe. And I thought to myself, well, that's hard to, you can't act that. It's very hard to create that. Red face, not breathing. It's possible. But I said, so can I ask him a question? I had never done that before, and I'd been filming people for at least 10 years at that point. And she said, he says yes. And I said, I wanted to say, dude, what's up with you? But I said, so why do people have this negative reaction when they're around you? They can't breathe. They're feeling like their heart's racing, and they cry. And I asked it that way as a challenge, because if it was her talking about him, there would be a certain way to say that. And she's from a religious family. But he said, I brought more of Source with me. And when people get close to me, they feel that unconditional love. Source. He used the word source. He didn't use father or any of the religious terminology, which I thought was weird. But he said that thing, unconditional love. That topic shows up often in the data. Dr. Grayson's book talk, or his talk called What I Left Out of My Book After, he said 85% of the people have near-death experiences experience seeing Source or God, and they describe indescribable joy, unconditional love, and non-judgmental acceptance. Those three are the major terms, 85%. And what he is saying with this answer to my question was he was saying something similar. People, when they get close to me, they experience this unconditional love. And I said in response to that, not so much with the Romans. And I said that because I thought, okay, people around you, they go, oh my gosh. Jennifer Schaefer, who was the medium, said, I don't know what that sentence means, but he's laughing. So think about that construct. I made a joke, not so much with the Romans, because clearly they weren't feeling unconditional love around the guy. So anyway, from that point forward, I realized, oh my gosh, I can ask questions that have comedic answers. So, for example, I'll say when somebody says they're seeing him under a guided meditation, and again, some of them never heard of me, don't know me from Adam. They say, I'm seeing Jesus. And I'll say, well, what's he wearing? And if they say, oh, he's wearing robes, or something, they're having an emotional reaction to that. It's like, who wouldn't? I'll say, well, can he change into something more conducive to conversation? And they always say the same outfit, no matter who's seeing him. Jeans and a T-shirt.
Huh.
And I said, well, does the guy have no clothes in his closet? I mean, why is it always, it doesn't matter. Everybody says the same thing. Oh, he's wearing jeans and a T-shirt. But recently, I had a woman say that, and I said, well, I don't even know why I asked. I said, so we'll take a look at his T-shirt. Does it say anything? Is there anything written on there? She looked, and then she laughed, and she said, it says The Grateful Dead. What a sense of humor.
Yeah,
that's
she
great.
wasn't thinking it. I wasn't thinking it. You know what I'm saying? And it's grateful for people on the flip side to realize you can converse with them, that you can talk to them, that we don't have to be afraid of talking to them, that what they're trying to do is, and this relates directly to what you're doing, which is when creatures from another dimension eventually want to contact us, and they have, it's going to be telepathically. Close Encounters of the Third Kind and science back in the 1960s, and it's in the book, Close Encounters of the Flip Side Kind. They did a conference in Washington, the CIA, NSA, all those people got together, and they're like, well, how are we going to communicate with aliens? And they came up with these two mathematical constructs, which is music and light, which is why in Close Encounters you da-da-da-da-da, right? Because those constants should apply to travel throughout the universe, unless you're traveling interdimensionally. Then you don't have to worry about the physics of this universe. So how do people communicate with animals? How do animals communicate?
Yeah.
And if we start to think about that, Dr. Galliano in Australia has shown that corn summons insects to save them from other predators. Corn. Dogs can smell cancer. Bees can see UV light. Elephants can talk over, 10 miles. Octopuses do more with 8 brains in 1 year than we do with 1 brain in 80 years. Shape-shifting. There's so many dimensions on our planet we're not aware of that we aren't even bothering to focus on. We're talking about going to Mars. I'm showing people in a very simple way. You can go to Mars today, now. You don't have to physically leave your body. You can go to you can go visit a black hole. You can go to deep recesses in space and this is why they can travel to us. We think they're getting in a ship and traveling here.
Yeah.
They're in a ship, but they're interdimensionally moving here. All they're doing is shifting our awareness. As the gray guy that I was talking to in the Simon Bone interview said, I'm here. I live here. I don't have to go anywhere. You just can't see me because I'm in another dimension. Our bases, you've heard that term, our bases are here now that we exist in. We can't see them because it's literally, if you're going to have, like notes on a piano, right? Their dimensions are over here and ours are here. We're never going to be able to see that until we bypass the filters on the brain, allow ourselves to access this information, learn how to communicate with plants, with trees. We used to, I've heard it consistently in this research, trees saying, you used to talk to us, you've forgotten how, or you've blocked it, because that's how humans were able to progress, by blocking this information. So once we're able to do that, once we can start focusing on that, and it won't be tomorrow, clearly, but it will be eventually, where we're talking to each other, we're doing a podcast telepathically. We don't need to plant stuff in our brains. We don't need to put digital stuff in our heads to communicate with other human beings. People do it all the time. We're just unaware of it. Anyway, I sound like I'm preaching, but
Well, from your research, are there any methods that you've seen or that you practice that you've encouraged other people to practice that help to either, raise people's consciousness or to help break down those filters, over time?
Great question. I think it's a multi-part answer. Number one is learn how to meditate. Med means measure in Latin, so you're measuring your thoughts. Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin Healthy Minds Project has shown that meditation can cure or alleviate symptoms of depression. So that should be a first order of business for anybody that's in healthcare. It literally changes the shape of the amygdala, the thing that helps with serotonin release. So that's already something that people are doing. In terms of our own daily day-to-day process, meditation can help us with all kinds of emotions and problems and issues and stress. Mindfulness comes out of Davidson's study because people were complaining that meditation, they thought it was associated with a religious concept. So they just used the word mindfulness instead of meditation. And they've shown that all the schools in the United States that use mindfulness for a 10-minute meditation, their grades go up, their world goes up. So I've asked people this question. So how do you communicate with us? And one of the best answers I've heard came via a dream my wife had, where she saw Luana Anders, who she had met. But Luana had passed away 20 years ago. And so Luana was in the dream, but my wife had the presence of mind to say, wait a second, you passed away 20 years ago. What are you doing here? And Luana said, well, think of 11/11. I know she held up like a toy. She held up a toy, and it was a spaceship. She said, well, this is how I got here. She said, but think of 11/11. Now, I love to point out that in the analog era, nobody went around saying, hey, it's 49 minutes to noon. It's the numbers themselves, because they look like some form of communication. An 11 is like a passageway or a hallway, and the other 11 is a hallway, and the intersection is the fence. Once we step off stage, like I said, 25 years feels like 5 or 10 minutes. Exponentially, they're traveling or in another frequency that's much, much more than ours. So in order for them to come back here or slow themselves down, we also have to speed ourselves up. As one person described it, imagine yourself being a supersonic jet and you're slowing down to converse with somebody who's in a VW van with the windows rolled up, traveling down a mountain road. They're like this, bouncing along, and the supersonic jet slows down. There's not much you can convey. There's like a couple of words maybe, or an image, but that's the essence of it. So how do we elevate ourselves? Well, it's also, if you think of what the terminology is, increasing your frequency, is that really what it is? Or is it clearing away the cacophony of your frequency? So I'll ask, and this is where it gets something that's proactive. You can ask people. Let's say you want to talk to somebody on the flip side, and you meditate on them, and you do this meditation where you picture them sitting in front of you, and now you start to ask them questions, and you're asking them to nod, shake their head no, or shrug, or give you a thumbs up. And you start questions very simply, like who greeted you when you crossed over? And they'll put an image in your mind. And you might say, oh, that's logical. Of course, her father. But try not to judge whatever comes forward, and then continue the questions. You're asking these questions. And this, by the way, came from Michael Newton during a session with Jennifer, where he said, say their name, ask them questions. When you get an answer, before you can ask the question, you'll know you've made a connection. An example would be, I'm picturing Alex after you've left the planet. Mm-hmm. And I say, I'm about to ask, what was your favorite food? And your answer is mint ice cream. But before I ask the question, I go, well, let me ask Alex a question. And I see mint ice cream. Mm. And then I realize, oh, I was going to ask him this question. That's what they do. Because they're outside of time. They can alter, they know what you're going to ask. Split second before you ask it. So that's one way of demonstrating that you can converse. So once you're doing that, let's say, and one of the questions I tell people to ask is, where's a place that I can talk to you? And you can give them options, park, garden, forest, lake, your old restaurant that you used to like to go to. It doesn't matter. They'll put an image in your mind because they know that that's where you'll be connected to them. So you go there, you go to the park, and you continue the conversation. You keep asking them questions. And, you don't have to take everything as sacrosanct. You can write down the answers and then do it again. Or what I do is I then take it to a medium and say, you ask the questions. The movie Talking to Bill Paxton, Bill was a friend of mine, and it just so happened when he passed away, I was interviewing a medium who said, there's some guy named Bill here. And I asked 20 questions of Bill. Where did we meet? What were we doing? What were you doing? What was I doing? What did we do together? All detailed questions that only Billy could know. Then I went to another medium, and I had asked the identical questions. And then I went to another medium, and I had somebody else ask the question. So I wasn't even in the room when they asked the questions to the medium, a double-blind study. All three identical answers.
Wow.
Who greeted you when you crossed over? What are you doing now? And Bill kept telling me to tell people. He's he mocks me relentlessly, teases me continually to this day. But he would say, look, just tell people I can fly.
Yeah. Richard,
yeah.
Quick question. Do you think that these beings or whoever can take advantage of us, especially when we're in the state of sleep? And I was just thinking about how many of us, I'm in here, everyone's sleeping at night. And I think, these guys can probably observe us better when we're sleeping and do whatever they're trying to do.
As can your relatives and loved ones.
Yeah.
If they want to pass along a message, that's the best way they can do it is in dreams. I just want to say this, which is on stage, because of the way we construct our reality, polarized, negative, positive, yin yang, we assume that their people would have a motivation to manipulate, that for lack of a better term. It doesn't exist in the research. You talk to people on other planets, you go, why are you coming here? The logical assumption would be like, you want to populate our place. That's human thinking. or as I like to call it, human-centric thinking. I mean, is there any other kind? But they are trying to help us. There's sacrosanct, I would only call it rules of the universe, which is you cannot interfere with a civilization. I've met people who are diplomats who go around to meeting with different civilizations. And I mean, there are people on the planet like having a life, but unbeknownst to them, their subconscious self goes to other planets and helps them with what we're talking about, helps them. They're not allowed to interfere. So they can't. And the other thing is this, they seed planets. So I've talked to people who are in a class. So classrooms is a very proponent about, you know, that comes off a lot in the book. Here it is. Divine counsels in the afterlife. So I'm talking to somebody on a council and I say, what do you do over on the flip side? And they'll say, well, I'm teaching a class. And then I'll say, can we go visit the class? And they now take me into an amphitheater, and the person seeing it, the teacher's there, the students are there. And I ask, what are you teaching? I mean, it is what happened to me. I'll just really quickly, when Luana was passing away, she said to me, I have this recurring dream. I'm in a classroom in another universe, she said. Everyone's dressed in white, speaking a language I've never heard before. And I went, oh, okay, that must be the morphine talking, you know, for cancer. I thought she was hallucinating. Then the night she passed, her close friend called me and said, oh, I had this wonderful dream about Luana. She was in the fourth dimension, she said, in a classroom dressed in white. And she seemed really happy. And then I mentioned that to her hospice care nurse, and she said, oh, my God, that was her dream that she had constantly. And so when I started this research, I picked up Michael Newton's book, Journey of Souls. And in the first chapter, a guy's talking about a classroom in the afterlife. Everyone's dressed in white, etc. So when I came around to me, first I had an out-of-body experience where I shot into deep space. It's in Flipside, where I was working in New York City, and I saw myself flying through like different arenas. And then I made a sharp turn, and suddenly I was in another universe. And I can only describe that because instead of going this way, I was going this way. And Luana was standing there waiting for me. And she opened her eyes and she said, in my head, telepathically, you were looking for me. Here is where I am. Some guy outside my window in New York hit his truck horn, and that made me come back like a rubber band. But I went through the same path that I had come. I could see Manhattan coming at me like full speed. That startled me and made me go into this research. And ultimately, when I did my first hypnotherapy session, it's in Flipside, I said to the hypnotherapist, I want to go visit my friend Luana. And I found myself in a classroom. Okay. I went to a classroom beforehand. I didn't know anybody in the class. The teacher acted like she knew me. She said, oh my God, my friend Rich is here. Oh, this is great. What are you doing here? She introduced me to the class. She said they were working on geometric shapes that retain all of our memories that go into the Akashic Library. Never heard of such a thing, but she was describing it to her. And then I went to this other classroom, and now here's where it gets interesting. I'm in this giant auditorium, and I'm talking to the hypnotherapist, and I'm saying, I'm in a classroom, and this is about the healing light of the universe. And one of the students turns and looks at me and says, you don't know what you're talking about. And I realized everyone in the auditorium could hear me talking. And the teacher was on stage like a 10-foot tall green person who he had stopped to hear me talking. And I went, I said to the hypnotherapist, I don't think I'm supposed to be here. I don't think I'm supposed to talk. But I came a long way, so I'm going to continue. And so this is and so then I turned to the guy and I said, listen, not everybody signs up for a lifetime where they're going to heal people. And people do sign up for lifetimes to learn about the efficacy of healing people and whether they should or should not become a doctor in a future lifetime. And he then said, oh, you do know what you're talking about. It was a very weird moment. In the back was my friend Luana, and she looked about 20, way before I met her. And she looked at me like, what are you doing here? Like, what is this? Cut to 2 years later, I'm with another hypnotherapist. I thought, well, let's just see if I go anywhere. As he started counting me down, I was in that classroom again. But now Luana was with me and we were on stage. She had walked me 2 years later, 20 seconds later. I'm down on the stage. She's introducing me to this tall green alien creature who's the professor, who looks very intense. And she's apologizing. I'm so sorry. My friend interrupted your class. I don't know what he's doing. He's doing some goofy project back on Earth, blah, 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 blah. And I look at the guy, you know, it's like the Shakespearean nightmare. You wake up, you're in the middle of a play. Like, what is this play? And he looks at me, he goes, well, what's your question? But thank God I had the presence of mind to ask. And I said, was I correct in my assessment about the healing light of the universe? Blah, 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 blah. So what's the point of that? We have classrooms where people seed planets for the future. Earth is an experiment. Mars was an experiment that didn't work, according to these people. There are people in classrooms, they go around and they choose places to see where life is going to continue. Not humanoids per se. That's centric thinking. But life continues. So we leave the planet gets destroyed, the sun blows up the planet, as will happen in 8 billion years. All the people on the planet will move on to another place, go back home, plan their next lifetime. Does that answer your question, or does that make more questions?
There's always more questions in this this field of study.
No, it's true. Anyway, you know, if your audience wants to reach out to me, Martini Prods or richardmartini.com.
There's a lot of
a guided meditation. I do those. I do them over Zoom. It takes about an hour. I do them like a couple times a week with people, and that's just something I do. You can book one. I mean, my Jennifer Schaefer, who is booked from here to Timbuktu, said to me, "You got to, charge people and book these things and whatever." So if somebody wants to do that further, or just ask me questions, they can go to Martini Prods, like productions, Martini, like the drink, at Gmail. And I'll answer the question if I can. Oh, and you mentioned Quora. The fact that there's 80 billion people reading it doesn't matter. There's a forum at Quora called Hacking the Afterlife. And I spend about an hour every day just answering questions from people who've had an experience. I encourage people to share data, research, or experiences of any kind, especially if it has to do with consciousness. But it's sharing experiences. And it could be as simple as, I had a crazy dream where my grandmother came and talked to me. Or it could be a question. And I moderate the forum, so anybody who comes that wants to proselytize, be angry about it, I suggest that they go to another sandbox to play in, or they get blinked into the cornfield. You know that old Twilight Zone episode? Mm-hmm. With Billy Mummy, who would blink people if they annoyed him. So I try to keep the forum, free of that.
Hey, Richard, sorry to cut you off, but we got to. We're nearing the end of our episode here, so I think we got to call it a day here. But thank you very much for coming. I think that we may have to have you come back on because we could talk to you for days.
Very good.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thanks for doing this.
It was awesome. Thank you.
Thanks
for being part of our show.
Anytime. More later. Cool.